You know what's absolutely hilarious? Watching a Zentari try to walk in 1G gravity. Now imagine being one of the few humans at the Galactic Defense Academy, where every other species thinks your homeworld is basically hell incarnate, yet they somehow still manage to look down their various breathing appendages at you. That's exactly where Cadet Zara Khatri found herself, trying not to laugh as another senior officer face planted into the pristine floor of the Academy's main hall. "Oh dear, do be careful," Lieutenant MX Toral Zara called out, maintaining her professional demeanor while mentally adding another tally to her aliens eating floor count. The day had barely started, and she was already at 7. The Zentari officer's crystalline antennae flushed a deep purple of embarrassment as they attempted to right themselves, their environment suit whirring with the effort. "These gravity fluctuations are completely unnecessary," they muttered, their translator barely catching the words. "I don't understand why we must accommodate such barbaric planetary conditions." Zara bit her tongue. Quite literally. Being called a barbarian by someone who couldn't handle basic gravitational forces was rich, but as one of only 12 human cadets at the Academy, she had a reputation to maintain. Not that it stopped the whispers that followed her through the hollowed halls of what was supposedly the most prestigious military training facility in the known galaxy. "Did you hear? They don't even need environment suits on their homeworld. Impossible. The atmospheric pressure alone would crush any sensible being. I heard they drink dihydrogen monoxide. For fun." The conversations always ceased when she walked by, replaced by what passed for polite nods among the various species. Zara had learned to categorize them all: the slight bow of the Axori with their flowing tentacles, the wing flutter of the Pexi, and the rather dramatic full-body illumination of the Luxari. All of them, every single one, convinced that humans were some sort of primitive species that had somehow stumbled their way into space. It was during one of these typical mornings that Commander Vix Thal made their grand entrance into her life. The Drachnid officer was legendary among the Academy staff, known for their strict adherence to proper military protocol and their rather vocal opinions about the inclusion of lesser-developed species in the Galactic Defense Force. Cadet Khatri, the commander's voice, resonated through their environmental suit speaker, the tone carrying that particular flavor of condescension that seemed universal across all species. "I've been reviewing your performance records." Zara snapped to attention, even though she knew it was probably unnecessary. The Drachnid's 8 eyes blinked in their characteristic pattern of disapproval. "At ease, Cadet. I must say, these scores seem improbable. Especially your survival training results." "Thank you, sir. I assure you they're quite accurate." Zara maintained her professional smile, the one she'd perfected over months of similar conversations. Heyman, the commander's scales shifted in what Zara had learned to recognize as skepticism. "You're suggesting that you completed the extreme environment course without any protective gear, in natural atmospheric conditions?" "Yes, sir. Standard Earth clothing was sufficient." The corridor had grown quiet, other officers and cadets pretending not to eavesdrop while doing exactly that. Commander Vix Thal's environmental suit gave a slight whir as they adjusted their position. "Cadet, I've studied Earth's conditions. While your planet is uniquely hostile, I find it difficult to believe that any sentient species could evolve to survive such extremes without technological assistance. Perhaps there's been some error in the documentation." And there it was. The same old song and dance, just with a different partner. Zara could practically feel the smugness radiating through the commander's environment suit. The really amusing part. In about 3 standard cycles, the Academy would be announcing their new joint survival training program. And guess who had just been selected as one of the instructors? "No error," Zara replied, allowing just a hint of pride to color her voice. "Would you like a demonstration?" Commander Vix Thal's scales rippled in what might have been amusement or concern. It was always hard to tell with Drachnids. "Careful, Cadet. Overconfidence is hardly a desirable trait in an officer." "Of course, sir." "My apologies." Zara bowed slightly, already imagining the commander's reaction to the upcoming training announcement. "I'll try to keep my barbaric tendencies in check." As she watched the commander glide away, environmental suit humming with the effort of maintaining their preferred atmospheric pressure, Zara couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best revenge was simply waiting for reality to prove your point. And reality, especially Earth's version of it, had a way of being particularly convincing. The Academy's main auditorium was packed tighter than a Martian pressure seal, which was ironic considering half the attendees were complaining about being too close to their neighbors. Zara sat in the front row with the other human cadets, watching Admiral EX Therion's hologram flicker as they made what had to be the most entertaining announcement of the academic cycle. In light of recent field operation failures in various extreme environments, the Admiral's translated voice echoed, their bioluminescent patches pulsing with each word. The Academy is implementing a mandatory survival training program. This initiative will be led by our Earthborn cadets. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the inevitable wave of whispers, clicks, and electromagnetic pulses that constituted alien murmuring. Zara exchanged glances with her fellow human instructors, each trying not to grin too obviously. Marcus Chen, the Arctic survival specialist, leaned over. 10 credits, says Commander Vixthal's scales fall off from sheer indignation, he whispered. His reputation for surviving 3 weeks in a Siberian winter, with nothing but a knife and a really bad attitude, made him perfect for this role. On Zara's other side, Nikolai Volkov, the mountain warfare expert, who'd once scaled Olympus Mons on Mars for fun, was already taking notes. Look at third row, left section, he muttered in his thick Russian accent. Pretty sure that Aksori just leaked some fluid from their shock sacks. Maya Patel, whose desert combat expertise had earned her the nickname Dune Walker back on Earth, didn't bother hiding her smirk. Well, at least they're taking it better than expected. Nobody's fainted yet. Admiral EX Therion continued, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the growing chaos. These 4 cadets have demonstrated exceptional survival capabilities in conditions that our standard training protocols classify as unsurvivable. They will be instructing senior officers in adaptation techniques for various extreme environments. Commander Vixthal's voice cut through the commotion. Admiral, with all due respect, which, Zara noted, meant absolutely none, are we genuinely expected to take instruction from cadets, not just cadets, Maya whispered, standing up as their names were called. Deathworlders. They walked to the stage, each step punctuated by the sound of environmental suits adjusting to maintain safe distances. Zara couldn't help but notice how the front rows collectively leaned backward. Cadet Chen will oversee cold weather survival training, the Admiral announced. Marcus stepped forward, his compact frame belying the strength that had helped him survive temperatures that would freeze most environmental suits solid. Cadet Volkov, high altitude and low pressure environments. Nikolai's tall, lean figure drew nervous glances. Someone in the audience muttered something about unnecessary atmospheric challenges. Cadet Patel, desert and high-temperature survival. Maya's presence caused several Luxari to dim their bioluminescence in what Zara recognized as their species equivalent of a gulp. And Cadet Khatri will serve as head instructor, coordinating the overall program. Zara stepped forward, enjoying the way Commander Vixthal's scales were indeed beginning to look a bit loose. The questions started immediately, each more incredulous than the last. Without environmental suits, in natural gravity, exposed to raw atmosphere, will we be expected to consume local sustenance? Marcus cleared his throat. To answer your questions, yes, 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 and if you want to survive, absolutely yes. A Pexi officer in the third row fluttered their wings in agitation. This is absurd. How can you possibly expect us to function in such conditions? The gravity alone would crush our exoskeletons. That's why we're here to teach you, Sir Maya replied smoothly. We'll start with gravity adaptation and work our way up to the really fun stuff. Fun, the word was translated in about 20 different ways, none of them positive. Nikolai stepped forward, his grin just a touch too wide to be comforting. DA fun. Like learning how to make fire without plasma inducers, finding water without molecular synthesizers, and staying warm without temperature regulators. The course will last 6 standard cycles, Zara announced, watching various appendages, tentacles, and sensory organs twitch in dismay. We'll begin with basic survival skills and progress to environment-specific challenges. Attendance is mandatory for all senior officers. Commander Vixthal's environmental suit gave an audible wheeze. This is unprecedented. Surely the Admiral cannot expect. Oh, but I do, Admiral EX Therion's hologram interrupted. The galaxy is vast, officers, and we cannot always choose our battlefield conditions. It's time we learn to adapt rather than rely solely on technology. As the announcement concluded and the shell-shocked officers filed out, Zara gathered her team. Well, that went about as expected. A better Marcus corrected. Did you see the Zentari in the back actually try to calculate the gravity load on their crystalline structure? Pretty sure they blew a neural fuse. Maya was already pulling up their training schedule on her datapad. We should start with something simple. Maybe a nice 5-mile hike in standard Earth gravity. With full gear, Nikolai added. No environmental suits. In the rain, Zara finished, earning appreciative nods from her fellow instructors. As they left the auditorium, they passed Commander Vikesthal engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument with their environmental suit's gravity compensator. The device was clearly winning. You know, Marcus mused, I almost feel bad for them. Almost the others agreed in unison, already planning their first lesson in what it meant to be a Deathworlder. The next 6 cycles were going to be very interesting indeed. The Academy's environmental simulation chamber was a marvel of galactic engineering, capable of recreating conditions from thousands of worlds. Right now, however, it was giving the maintenance crew fits as they tried to understand the humans' requirements. No, you don't need to filter out the atmospheric moisture, Zara explained to the increasingly frustrated Luxari technician. We want the humidity. Actually, crank it up to about 80%. The technician's bioluminescent spots flickered in distress. But the equipment will corrode. That's kind of the point, Marcus chimed in, reviewing the Arctic simulation parameters. If it's not uncomfortable, we're not doing it right. Across the chamber, Maya was fine-tuning the desert environment parameters, while a group of horrified engineers watched their precious atmospheric processors being deliberately miscalibrated. Temperature fluctuations between 45 and -5 degrees Celsius, she instructed. And yes, I want the sandstorms. Real ones, not the gentle breeze you call a storm. Nikolai, meanwhile, was gleefully adjusting the gravity controls for his mountain survival course. We start at 1G, then gradually increase as they climb, and no, they cannot use gravitic compensators. Is defeat entire purpose. The chamber's chief engineer, a Zentari named TX Loth, was watching the proceedings with what passed for horror among their species. All their crystalline facets turned a sickly shade of green. This is most irregular, they managed through their translator. The equipment wasn't designed for such extreme variations, and the safety protocols will remain in place, Zara assured them, just modified. We're not trying to kill anyone. We're just trying to show them what it's like to survive without depending on technology. As if to emphasize her point, Maya was busy confiscating environmental suits from a rack near the entrance. These go into storage. They can have them back after they learn to handle basic temperature regulation. But how will they regulate their body temperature without thermal controls? TX Loth's crystals chimed in distress. Marcus grinned, holding up what looked like primitive fabric. The old-fashioned way. Layers. The word layers was translated into at least 6 different languages, each version sounding more confused than the last. A small crowd had gathered at the chamber's observation window, where several senior officers were watching the preparations with a mixture of disdain and poorly concealed anxiety. Commander Vikesthal was among them, their scales shifting between patterns that Zara had learned to interpret as deeply offended and secretly terrified. They can't seriously expect us to use. What did they call it? Cotton, one officer whispered, not quite quietly enough. I heard they're going to make us drink dihydrogen monoxide directly from planetary sources, another added, their tentacles curling in disgust. Zara turned to her team. Should we tell them about the Mires? Yet Nikolai replied with a wicked grin. Is better to be surprised. The preparation continued throughout the day. Each human instructor added their own special touch to the simulation. Marcus programmed in unexpected blizzards, Maya arranged for sand to get literally everywhere, and Nikolai ensured that the air would get progressively thinner as participants climbed. The coup de grace came when Zara announced that all emergency beacons would be collected before each session. But how will we signal for extraction? Commander Vikesthal demanded, their environmental suit speakers barely containing their indignation. That's part of the training, Zara explained cheerfully. Sometimes you have to rescue yourself. As the day wound down, the human instructors gathered to review their work. The environmental chamber now contained 4 distinct hellscapes, as the alien officers had taken to calling them, each designed to push the participants well beyond their technological comfort zones. Think we went too easy on them? Maya asked, watching the maintenance crew run final diagnostics. Marcus snorted. We're starting them with a basic Earth Park hike in spring. If anything, we're being too nice. They'll thank us later, Zara said, though she couldn't quite keep a straight face. You know, probably. Maybe, eventually. Is like my old instructor used to say, Nikolai mused. Sometimes best way to learn to swim is to fall in lake. I thought you learned to swim in Siberia, Marcus asked. DA. In winter. Is why I am such good teacher. As they left the chamber, Zara caught sight of their first group of trainees trying to figure out how to put on basic Earth-standard hiking boots. 3 of them were holding the boots upside down, and one appeared to be attempting to communicate with their pair telepathically. Tomorrow was going to be interesting, to say the least. The first day of survival training began exactly as you'd expect when you take 30 high-ranking alien officers and strip them of their technological crutches with complete and utter chaos. "No, sir, you can't wear your gravitic stabilizer," Zara explained for the 7th time to a Pexi officer who was practically molting with anxiety. "And yes, those are real clouds. No, they won't dissolve your exoskeleton." The assembled officers stood or floated, or wavered, depending on their species at the entrance to the Environmental Chamber's basic Earth Park simulation. Most were still struggling with the concept of clothes, having never worn anything but environmental suits. "These fabric containment units are inefficient," complained a Luxari officer, who had somehow managed to put their pants on backwards. Their bioluminescent patches were flashing in what Zara recognized as their species' equivalent of a temper tantrum. Marcus walked past, somehow keeping a straight face. "Those fabric containment units kept humans alive for thousands of years before we invented climate control. You'll survive." Commander Vikesthal was having a particularly rough time. Their usually immaculate scales were ruffled in all the wrong directions as they attempted to master bipedal locomotion without artificial assistance. The commander had insisted on leading by example, which would have been admirable if they weren't currently face down in the simulated grass. The gravity. "It's defective," they insisted, their voice muffled by the turf. Maya helped them up, trying not to smile. "Actually, sir, this is just how Earth feels all the time. We call it standard gravity." Standard, the commander's translator couldn't quite capture the mix of horror and disbelief in their voice. "There is nothing standard about being crushed into the ground." Nikolai, who was supposed to be teaching basic knot tying, had instead become fascinated watching a group of Zentari officers attempt to handle water bottles. Their crystalline appendages kept slipping on the condensation, sending bottles flying in all directions. "It is like juggling act," he commented to no one in particular. But less coordinated. The real entertainment began when they reached the first incline, a gentle slope that wouldn't have winded a human child. The aliens, however, treated it like they were scaling Mount Everest. I can't go on," wheezed an Axori officer, their tentacles dramatically splayed across a rock. They had managed to climb approximately 3 meters. "The atmospheric pressure, it's too much." "We're still in standard Earth atmosphere," Zara pointed out helpfully. "We haven't even started the hard stuff yet." The word "yet" triggered a wave of distress signals from various biological communication systems flashing, clicking, humming, and what appeared to be spontaneous color changes. Things got even more interesting when it started to rain. It wasn't even real rain, just the Environmental Chamber's basic precipitation program, but you'd have thought they'd unleashed a chemical weapon. "We're being bombarded with dihydrogen monoxide," screamed a particularly excitable Luxari, their glow practically strobing in panic. "That's drinking water," Marcus explained patiently. "The same stuff you've been carrying in those bottles you keep dropping." "You mean this liquid falls from the sky on your world?" Commander Vikesthal had managed to stand up again, only to be so startled by this revelation that they lost balance and rolled halfway down the slope. The day continued in much the same vein. The officers discovered that Earth vegetation didn't try to eat them, much to their surprise, that insects were not actually micro-drones despite several lengthy arguments, and that sweating was in fact a natural process and not a sign of imminent dissolution. But something interesting happened as the hours passed. After the initial shock wore off, some of the officers began to adapt. A young Zentari figured out how to use their crystalline structure to better distribute weight while walking. A group of Axori discovered their tentacles were actually excellent for grip on rough terrain. Even Commander Vikesthal managed to stay vertical for almost 10 consecutive minutes. The breakthrough moment came when a Pexi officer, after falling into a shallow stream, emerged drenched but laughing. "It's not actually killing me," they announced, sounding amazed. "Of course not," Maya replied. "Water's your friend out here, most of the time anyway." As they wrapped up the first day's training, Zara noticed something had changed in the way the officers looked at their human instructors. The condescension had been replaced by something that bordered on respect, or at least a healthy fear, which was close enough for now. Commander Vikesthal approached her as they were packing up, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned about gravity the hard way. "Cadet Khatri." They began, their scales shifting in what might have been embarrassment, I believe I may have underestimated the challenges of your world. That's a good start, Sir Zara replied. Just wait until tomorrow. We're going to teach you how to make fire without a plasma inducer. The commander's scales went completely flat. You're joking. Nope. And after that, we'll learn about something really exciting called bugs. The commander's environmental suit, which they'd insisted on putting back on the moment training ended, gave an audible whimper. Progress, Zara decided, came in many forms. Sometimes it was a breakthrough in interstellar diplomacy, and sometimes it was watching a senior officer realize that maybe, just maybe, these Deathworlders knew what they were talking about after all. It was supposed to be a routine training session in the Arctic simulation when everything went sideways. Later, the technical report would blame a cascade failure in the environmental controls, but in the moment, all anyone knew was that the chamber's safety protocols had suddenly disengaged. The temperature plummeted to actual Arctic levels. The wind howled, and 30 alien officers found themselves facing real survival conditions for the first time. Status report, Zara shouted over the rising storm, already moving into action. The chamber's emergency exits had sealed another delightful side effect of the malfunction. Temperatures dropping fast, Marcus reported, his Arctic experience kicking in. We've got maybe 10 minutes before it hits lethal levels for most species here. The alien officers were already showing signs of severe distress. Their minimal cold weather gear, intended for a controlled training environment, wasn't nearly enough for these conditions. Commander Vixthal's scales were turning an alarming shade of blue. Everyone in a circle, now, Zara commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. To her surprise, the officers obeyed instantly. 3 days of training had taught them that when humans gave survival orders, you listened. Nikolai was already moving, his mountain experience proving invaluable. We make shelter. Maya, Marcus, gather everyone's gear. Zara, keep them moving. What happened next would later be described in Academy records as the incident that changed everything, though most aliens simply called it the day we understood. The human cadets worked with practiced efficiency. Maya and Marcus stripped down extra clothing layers, showing the aliens how to share body heat, a concept that horrified them right up until they realized it was keeping them alive. Nikolai, using nothing but packed snow and some basic equipment, constructed an emergency shelter that defied several laws of engineering but somehow stood strong against the wind. How Commander Vixthal managed through chattering mandibles. How are you doing this without technology? This is what we evolved to do, Zara explained, helping them into the shelter. Humans don't just survive extreme conditions, we learn from them. The next 2 hours became an impromptu masterclass in real survival skills. The humans demonstrated how to maintain core temperature, how to create emergency insulation from minimal materials, and how to keep morale up when everything went wrong. They even managed to get a fire going using primitive methods that made the alien officers question everything they thought they knew about physics. But the chemical reaction, a Luxari officer began. Less analyzing, more warming, Marcus interrupted, showing them how to safely position themselves near the flames. Physics debates can wait until we're not freezing. As they huddled in the shelter, something remarkable happened. The alien officers began to ask questions not out of skepticism, but genuine curiosity. You learned these skills as children, and Axori asked, their tentacles wrapped in improvised warmth layers. Some of them, Maya answered, showing a Zentari how to properly layer their crystalline structure to trap heat. The rest we picked up through training and experience. On Earth you adapt or, well, you don't. Commander Vixthal, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. I believe I owe you all an apology. The shelter grew quiet, save for the howling wind outside. When I first encountered humans, I thought your species was. They paused, scales shifting in embarrassment, primitive. That your reliance on physical adaptation rather than technological solutions was a sign of inferior development. And now, Zara prompted, already knowing the answer from the newfound respect in the commander's voice. Now I understand that what we saw as primitive was actually mastery. You don't just survive these conditions, you thrive in them. You turn disadvantages into advantages. Even now, without any technology, you've managed to protect an entire group of beings who would have perished without your knowledge. The chamber's systems finally came back online, warmth gradually returning. But nobody moved to leave the shelter immediately. Something had shifted in the dynamic between the species. This is why we call Earth a Deathworlder, Pexi officer realized aloud. Not because it's trying to kill you, but because it taught us to be stronger, Zara finished. Every challenge, every extreme condition, they're not obstacles. their opportunities to adapt, to improve, to survive. When they finally emerged from the shelter, the alien officers looked at their human instructors differently. Gone was the condescension, replaced by something that looked remarkably like admiration. Well, Commander Vixthal announced, their scales now showing patterns of determination. I believe we have much more to learn. Shall we continue with the training? The humans exchanged knowing looks. Finally, they were getting somewhere. Of course, Commander Zara replied with a grin. Just wait until you see what we have planned for desert survival. The collective groan from the alien officers was music to her ears. The final challenge was deceptively simple: survive for 48 hours in a rotating series of Earth's most delightful environments, using only the skills they'd learned. No environmental suits, no advanced tech, just pure survival knowledge and whatever they could carry on their backs. Remember, Zara addressed the assembled officers, who now stood with an alertness that would have been unthinkable 6 cycles ago. You'll face desert, mountain, Arctic and jungle conditions. Work together, trust your training, and don't forget rule number 1. Don't panic, the officers responded in unison, causing the human instructors to exchange proud glances. Commander Vixthal stepped forward, their scales arranged in what the humans had come to recognize as their game face pattern. Squad leaders, coordinate your teams. Remember your thermal regulation training, and for the love of all habitable worlds, don't forget to check your water supplies this time. The first environment shift came without warning: scorching desert heat, replacing the moderate chamber temperature. Instead of chaos, the aliens moved with practiced efficiency. The Zentari used their crystalline structures to reflect excess heat, while the Axori deployed their tentacles as makeshift sun shields for the more vulnerable species. They're actually doing it, Maya whispered, watching a group properly construct a solar still. And nobody's even complained about the sand yet. The mountain phase triggered automatically 6 hours later. As the air thinned and temperature dropped, the officers adjusted their breathing techniques, a skill that had once seemed impossible to master. The Pexi, once terrified of anything resembling altitude, now used their wing structures to help shield others from the wind. Look at their formation, Nikolai noted with approval. Perfect heat conservation pattern. Is beautiful, no. Even the Arctic phase, once their greatest nemesis, seemed to hold less terror. The aliens worked in seamless teams, constructing shelters and maintaining safe body temperatures with an efficiency that would have impressed even hardened Earth survivalists. The jungle phase brought its own challenges: humidity, insects, and the constant need to navigate dense vegetation. But where once they would have balked at such conditions, the officers now moved with confidence, even showing signs of enjoying the challenge. As the final hours ticked down, Commander Vixthal's team found themselves facing a flash flood scenario. Instead of freezing, they immediately implemented their emergency protocols. The commander themselves led the charge, their scales now adapted to channel water flow efficiently, a technique they'd developed after one particularly memorable swimming lesson. Cut simulation, Zara called, as the last minutes expired. The chamber slowly returned to its neutral state, revealing a group of tired but triumphant officers. The graduation ceremony that followed was unlike anything the Academy had ever seen. Admiral Yextherian's hologram presided over the proceedings, their bioluminescence bright with approval. Commander Vixthal took the podium, their scales arranged in formal presentation pattern. When this program began, I thought it was a mistake. How could cadets teach senior officers? How could primitive survival skills benefit an advanced spacefaring civilization? They paused, their scales rippling with amusement. I have never been more pleased to be proven wrong. The commander turned to face the human instructors. These Deathworlders didn't just teach us survival skills, they taught us resilience, adaptability, the power of working with our environment rather than trying to completely control it. In short, they taught us how to be better officers. The ceremony concluded with an unexpected announcement: the survival training program would become a permanent part of the Academy's curriculum, with the first class of alien officers now qualified to serve as assistant instructors alongside their human counterparts. Just remember, Zara told the graduating class, the next time someone calls Earth a death world, take it as a compliment. It's not about where you're from, it's about what you learn from it. Marcus couldn't resist adding one final comment: and maybe keep practicing those fire-starting skills. Some of you are still a bit shaky with the flint. The laughter that followed wasn't just polite diplomatic noise, it was the sound of genuine camaraderie, forged in the face of challenge and tempered by mutual respect. As the ceremony concluded, Commander Vixthal approached the human instructors one last time. So they said, scales showing a pattern the humans had never seen before. I hear Mars has some interesting survival challenges. Perhaps. A future joint training exercise. Zara grinned. Some things really had changed. Careful, Commander. That almost sounded like enthusiasm. Indeed, they replied, their scales shifting to match her smile. How terrifyingly human of me.